Stop the tape. Dr. Phil's voice cut through the studio like a blade. The cameras froze. The audience held their breath. In 17 years of broadcasting, he had never stopped filming mid-show. But the elderly man sitting across from him, hands trembling, eyes locked on the floor, had just said something that changed everything. "Sir, look at me," Dr. Phil said, his voice dropping to barely a whisper. "What really happened the night you left?" What followed was a confession that would shatter a family and heal it at the same time. 3 weeks earlier, the Dr. Phil show had received a letter. It was handwritten in shaky cursive on lined notebook paper. The return address was from a nursing home in rural Ohio. The letter was from Margaret Sullivan, 76 years old, and it contained one desperate plea. "My husband left us 40 years ago. My grandchildren never met him. He's dying now, and they need answers. Can you help us?" The show's producers made contact immediately. They learned that Thomas Sullivan, 82, had walked out on his family in 1984 when his children were still young. No explanation. No goodbye. Just an empty closet and decades of unanswered questions. Margaret had spent 4 decades raising their 3 children alone. The kids, now adults with families of their own, had grown up with a hole where their father should have been. Birthday parties without him. Graduations without him. Weddings without him. But 3 months ago, Margaret received a call from a nursing home. Thomas had been admitted with stage 4 lung cancer. He was dying, and he had listed her as his emergency contact. "I hadn't spoken to him in 40 years, Margaret told the producer on the phone. "But when they called, something in me broke. I needed to know why. My children needed to know why." Dr. Phil immediately agreed to do the show. This wasn't about ratings or drama. This was about a family that had been fractured for 4 decades, and an old man running out of time to make things right. The taping was scheduled for a Tuesday afternoon. The Sullivan family arrived at the studio in Los Angeles. Margaret, their 3 adult children, David, 52, Jennifer, 49, and Michael, 46, and 4 grandchildren who had never met their grandfather. Thomas was transported from the nursing home in Ohio. He arrived in a wheelchair, oxygen tank attached, wearing clothes that hung loose on his frail frame. Stage makeup couldn't hide how sick he was. Dr. Phil met with Thomas privately before the show. "Why are you doing this?" he asked. Thomas's voice was barely audible. "Because I'm a coward who's running out of time." The show began like any other episode. Dr. Phil introduced the family to the audience, explaining the situation with his characteristic directness. Margaret sat in the guest chair, dignified despite the pain etched on her face. Her children flanked her, a united front built over 40 years of his absence. "For 4 decades you raised 3 children alone," Dr. Phil said to Margaret. "What was that like?" "Lonely," Margaret answered simply. "Every night I'd lie awake wondering what I did wrong. Every milestone I celebrated with our kids I wondered where he was. Was he happy? Did he ever think about us?" The audience was already reaching for tissues. But they had no idea what was coming. Dr. Phil then brought out Thomas. The wheelchair rolled onto stage, and the studio fell silent. Margaret's hand flew to her mouth. The children stared at the stranger who was their father. The grandchildren leaned forward, trying to reconcile family stories with the frail old man in front of them. "Thomas," Dr. Phil began, 40 years ago you walked out on this family. No explanation. No contact. Why?" Thomas stared at his lap. The silence stretched uncomfortably. The audience shifted in their seats. "I was ashamed," Thomas finally whispered. "Ashamed of what?" Dr. Phil pressed. "Of failing them." "That's not an answer," Dr. Phil said firmly. "That's an excuse. These people deserve the truth." Thomas's hands gripped the wheelchair armrests. His breathing, already labored from the oxygen, became more ragged. Margaret leaned forward. The children watched, decades of anger and hurt visible on their faces. "I lost my job," Thomas said finally. The plant closed. I couldn't find work. We were about to lose the house. I couldn't provide for my family. Dr. Phil waited. The studio waited. Everyone sensed there was more. And then I did something unforgivable. The air in the studio changed. Even the crew stopped moving. I took out a loan. From the wrong people. When I couldn't pay it back, they threatened my family. They knew where my kids went to school. They knew Margaret's work schedule. They showed me pictures. Margaret gasped. This was new information. 40 years of thinking she'd done something wrong, and it had been about money and threats all along. So you left, Dr. Phil said, not as a question but as a statement. I thought if I disappeared they'd leave my family alone. I thought I was protecting them. Stop. Dr. Phil held up his hand. His expression had changed. Stop the tape. The production crew froze. This never happened. Dr. Phil looked directly at the cameras. Stop recording. Then he turned to his producer standing off stage. Clear the studio. Family only. The audience was ushered out, confused but compliant. The camera operators put down their equipment. For the next 20 minutes, Dr. Phil sat with the Sullivan family in that empty studio and let Thomas tell the whole truth, every detail, every threat, every choice he made that night 40 years ago. What was said in those 20 minutes would never be broadcast. It was too raw, too personal, too sacred. When the cameras finally resumed, Thomas was weeping openly. Margaret had moved from her chair and was kneeling beside his wheelchair, holding his hand, the first time she'd touched him in 40 years. The children were crying. The grandchildren, who'd arrived as strangers, were gathered around the grandfather they'd never known. Subscribe and leave a comment. Because the most powerful part of this story is still ahead. Dr. Phil sat back in his chair, watching this fractured family begin to stitch itself back together. He pulled an envelope from his jacket pocket, something he'd been carrying since before the show started. Thomas, Dr. Phil said quietly, you said you failed your family? But I did some research. Margaret, did you know that for the past 40 years, there's been money deposited into a trust account in your children's names? Margaret's head snapped up. What? Dr. Phil opened the envelope and pulled out bank statements. Every month for 40 years. Not much, $200, $300 when he could manage it. The deposits came from different states, different jobs. But they never stopped. David, the eldest son, stood up. That's not possible. We never. The trust was set up so it couldn't be accessed until specific conditions were met. Dr. Phil continued. College education. First home purchase. Medical emergencies. The trust has been there the entire time, protecting this family from the shadows. Thomas had never stopped being a father. He'd just done it from a distance he thought was safe. Margaret was shaking her head, tears streaming down her face. Why didn't you tell us? Why didn't you let us help you? Because those men were real, Thomas said. And I couldn't risk it. I couldn't risk you. Dr. Phil leaned forward. Thomas, those men, where are they now? Dead or in prison, last I checked. Have been for over 20 years. And yet you stayed away. Because by then, how could I come back? How could I face them after what I'd done? The studio fell into that particular silence that comes when truth is finally spoken after decades of lies and half-truths. Dr. Phil turned to Margaret. You've carried anger and hurt for 40 years. You raised 3 incredible human beings alone. You survived. The question is, what do you want to do now? Margaret looked at Thomas. Really looked at him for the first time since he'd rolled onto that stage. She saw the 82-year-old man with months to live. But she also saw the 42-year-old man who'd kissed her goodbye one morning and never came home. I want my husband back, she whispered. Even if it's just for a little while. The audience, watching from the monitors backstage, erupted in tears. Dr. Phil nodded slowly. He reached into his jacket again and pulled out another document. Thomas, I took the liberty of making some arrangements. If your family agrees, there's a hospice facility in Ohio that specializes in end-of-life care. They have family accommodations. You wouldn't have to go through this alone." Thomas looked at his children, the babies he'd left behind, now middle-aged adults with gray in their hair, and their own children. "I don't deserve—" "Stop," Jennifer, his daughter, interrupted. Her voice was firm but not unkind. "You don't get to decide what we do or don't give you. You made choices 40 years ago. We get to make choices now." She looked at her brothers. Some silent communication passed between them, the kind only siblings share. David nodded. Michael wiped his eyes and nodded too. Jennifer turned back to her father. "We're not doing this for you. We're doing this for us. And for Mom. And for your grandchildren who deserve to know their grandfather, even if it's just for a little while. Dr. Phil stood up and walked to Thomas's wheelchair. He knelt down so they were eye to eye. "Sir, you made a choice 40 years ago that you thought was protecting your family. It was the wrong choice. You know that now. But here's the thing about families, they're resilient. They bend, but they don't always break. Your family bent, but they didn't break. And now you have a chance to spend your final days being the man you always wanted to be for them." Thomas nodded, unable to speak through his tears. Dr. Phil pulled a small bracelet from his pocket, one of those cheap woven friendship bracelets that kids make at summer camp. "One of your granddaughters wanted me to give this to you. She made it last night after she found out she was meeting you today. She said to tell you that even though she never met you, she always knew you were out there somewhere. That bracelet, that simple, child-made bracelet, broke something in Thomas that 40 years of isolation couldn't touch. He took it with shaking hands and slipped it over his wrist. It was bright purple and green, inexpertly knotted, with beads that spelled out, "Grandpa. She wants to know if you'll teach her to fish," Dr. Phil said softly. "She's 8 years old, and she's never been fishing. Her dad says it's something grandfathers are supposed to do." Thomas looked across at his youngest granddaughter, a little girl with Margaret's eyes and his late mother's smile. She waved shyly at him. "I'd like that," Thomas managed to say. The show ended there. But the story didn't. The Sullivan family spent the next 3 months together. Thomas moved into the hospice facility Dr. Phil had arranged. Margaret stayed in the family accommodations. The children visited every weekend. The grandchildren learned stories about their grandfather, both the man he'd been and the man he tried to be. Thomas taught his granddaughter to fish. They never caught anything, but she didn't care. She just wanted to sit beside him and listen to him talk about the fish he'd caught as a boy. He died on a Tuesday morning in January, surrounded by his family. Margaret was holding one hand. Jennifer was holding the other. His son stood at the foot of the bed. His grandchildren filled the room with flowers and drawings and that inexpertly knotted purple and green bracelet still on his wrist. Share and subscribe. Make sure this story is never forgotten. Dr. Phil attended the funeral. He didn't announce it or make it public. He simply stood in the back of the small church in Ohio and watched as a family said goodbye to a man they'd lost twice. Once 40 years ago, and once again 3 months ago. At the reception afterward, Margaret approached Dr. Phil. "Thank you," she said simply. "I didn't do anything," Dr. Phil replied. "Your family did all the hard work." "You gave us permission to do the hard work," Margaret corrected him. "You stopped the tape. You gave us space to be angry and hurt, and then to choose something else. That's everything." Dr. Phil learned something that day too. He'd been doing his show for 17 years, and he'd helped thousands of people. But this case taught him something fundamental about forgiveness and family. Later, he would say in an interview, "People think forgiveness is about the person who wronged you. It's not. It's about freeing yourself from carrying their mistake." Margaret could have held on to 40 years of anger until Thomas died. Instead, she chose to give herself 3 months of peace. That's not weak. That's the strongest thing I've ever seen. The bracelet, that simple purple and green friendship bracelet, sits in Dr. Phil's office now. Margaret gave it to him after the funeral. He'd want you to have it, she said. You gave him his family back. This is how we say thank you. And sometimes, that's what healing looks like. Not a dramatic revelation. Not a tearful reunion that solves everything. Just a choice, made in a moment of impossible pain, to let go of hurt and reach for connection instead. The Sullivan family still faces challenges. 40 years of absence doesn't disappear in 3 months. But they face those challenges together now, as a family should. The children know why their father left. The grandchildren have stories about their grandfather. And Margaret knows that the man she married, the one she thought had abandoned her, had loved her enough to sacrifice everything to protect her, even if he did it in the worst possible way. That's the legacy of that Tuesday afternoon when Dr. Phil stopped the tape. Not just one family healed, but a reminder to everyone watching, it's never too late to tell the truth. It's never too late to ask for forgiveness. And it's never too late to choose love over hurt. Because in the end, family isn't about being perfect. It's about being present. And Thomas Sullivan, for the last 3 months of his life, finally learned how to be present for his family again.